Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I want to welcome you for joining us today and for this program, Securities Arbitration Clinics, commemorating 25 years of law students aiding investors. My name is Jane Cobb and I'm Executive Director of the SEC Historical Society. If you're not familiar with the Society, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We're not legally affiliated with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, but we obviously share an appreciation of its mission. We work to preserve the history of the U.S. securities markets, and we do this by continually expanding the collection of unique materials in the virtual museum, where you've come to watch this program. Our panels today will be a key part of an exhibit we'll be launching in a few weeks that will include dozens of articles, papers, photos, oral histories, and other historical artifacts related to the 25-year history of investor rights clinics. Our moderator for panel 1, Professor Jill Gross, will provide more context for these clinics. But before I turn to her, I want to pay special thanks to former SEC Chairman Arthur Levitt. During his tenure, Chairman Levitt initiated the push to get law schools across the country to establish securities arbitration clinics. Chairman Levitt took time last week to record a special message for you about our program today. Let's take a listen.
I'm Arthur Levitt, and I'm delighted to join you virtually for this special program of the SEC Historical Society. I appreciate the work of the Society and its active members. Preserving and celebrating the history and institutional memory of the SEC is an important part of doing good regulatory work. You can't do good regulatory work without knowing what was contemplated and done before you or why. I especially appreciate your focus today on the 25th anniversary of the establishment of legal clinics at law schools to support investors in filing smaller claims. Today, critics may think this program sustains claims that have no merit, or that law schools should shutter them and focus on other public service work. But it would be a grave mistake to dismiss the value of this program and what it means for America's protections of investor rights. In its quarter century, this program has given access to investors who would otherwise not be able to secure counsel to pursue claim. And as we know, access to the law is one of the chief impediments to progress. And as we know, access to the law is one of the chief impediments to justice. Even the smallest claim must be heard. These clinics are an essential part of assuring that opportunity. That's why I favored the creation of these clinics when I was the SEC chair, and why I continue to support them today. It's a matter of justice. Moreover, these clinics provide valuable experience for emerging lawyers, those still being introduced to America's legal system are given real-life opportunities to explore our securities regulations and just what they mean. Many of today's best regulators and security lawyers receive their first taste of the complexities of regulatory principles and statutes in a clinic meeting. What's more, they help emerging lawyers see the balance of rights and risks that are at the heart of our system of investor protections and public markets. Even if young lawyers go into other specialties, they can see that securities laws and regulations exist for good reason and are often the best protection our free market system has against fraud. It's my hope that your session today explore these issues and that you develop new and better approaches to sustaining these clinics. I especially hope that you are able to summarize your findings and share them with law schools who host the clinics. They must be made aware of their contribution to the proper functioning of our free market system. That's a public service. Thanks for your interest and your hard work, and have a productive discussion today.
Thank you, Chairman Levitt. Chairman Levitt not only played a key role in getting law schools across the country to establish investor rights clinics, he is also known for his role in getting the SEC Historical Society off the ground nearly 25 years ago. And not that I'm biased, but what a terrific idea that was. And now I want to introduce you to our moderator for panel one, Professor Jill Gross. Jill is the Senior Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Law Operations, and is also Professor of Law at the Elisabeth Haub School of Law at Pace University. She's also the former director of Pace University's Investor Rights Clinic. Jill, thank you so much for all your great work on this program. I'm going to turn it over to you now and look forward to your discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Jane. I am delighted to be here, and I'd like to introduce our four esteemed panelists that will be joining me today. First, we'll have Barbara Black, the founder of Pace's Securities Arbitration Clinic when she was a professor at Pace Law School before she moved on to the University of Cincinnati College of Law and then retiring as a professor. We will then hear from Bruce Sanders, Adjunct Professor of Law and Director of the Investor Justice Clinic at Howard University School of Law. We then have Paul Radvany, Clinical Professor of Law at Fordham University School of Law and current Director of Fordham's Securities Arbitration Clinic. And then finally, Christine Lazaro, Professor of Clinical Legal Education, Assistant Dean of Co-Curricular Programs, and Director of the Securities Arbitration Clinic at St. John's University School of Law. Before we begin our panel discussion, I thought I would briefly describe the history of these clinics as developing in three waves. And when we refer to these clinics, whatever title they may have, it is essentially a law school program in which law students under faculty supervision and pursuant to a student practice order represent investors of modest means in their disputes with brokerage firms and or their individual brokers. Most of those disputes would end up going to either arbitration, mediation, or negotiation for dispute resolution. And there were three waves of these clinics founding. The first I like to describe as the founding wave from 1997 to 2003, which includes Pace's clinic and Fordham's clinic, among others. Second, the flourishing wave from 2004 to 2007, spurred on from funding from the New York State Attorney General's office. And these clinics mostly were in the New York area and include St. John's Clinic, which opened in 2004. And finally, the most recent wave, which started in 2008, mostly spurred on with grants from the FINRA Investor Education Foundation, and those include Howard Law in 2009. So we have with us today a representative from each one of these three waves of clinics. And so I'd really like to turn now to our panelists and hear more about their experiences teaching and directing these clinics. So Barbara, first, what prompted you to open Pace's Securities Arbitration Clinic?
So, seems like a long time ago. it is a long time ago, but it was March 1997. I received a phone call from Ron Long. Uh, Everybody's going to see Ron Long in a little while. He's the moderator of our second panel. At that time, Ron was in the office of Chairman Levitt at the SEC. So Ron called me up and inquired whether PACE would be interested in establishing a securities arbitration clinic. The SEC, as Chair Levitt referred to just a few moments ago, the SEC had heard from small investors that they had difficulty in arbitrating their disputes without legal representation, and that exacerbated perceptions of unfairness in the system. At the same time, PACE was exploring ways to provide hands-on experience to its law students. So I thought that a proposed securities arbitration clinic could meet the needs of both the SEC and PACE. The proposed clinic seemed an attractive intersection between the business curriculum and the skills training or the clinical program. Securities arbitration clinic might be attractive, for example, to students who would not be so interested perhaps in a criminal defense clinic. And in addition, and importantly from the investor protection aspect, it would not only help law students develop their legal skills, but it would also help out investors who could not obtain legal representation. So that's how the PACE clinic came about.
Great. And did you face any challenges in getting the clinic started?
Yeah, I faced a lot of challenges. Uh, uh, I was benefited enormously by the fact that PACE had a well-developed and well-managed skills training program in place. And in particular, I am forever grateful to Vanessa Merton, who was at that time the director of the clinical program at PACE. And she provided tremendous encouragement and assistance in developing the Securities Arbitration Clinic. I must also give a shout out to the law school's dean at the time, Richard Ottinger, who also provided steadfast support for the clinics. Now, besides those organizational instructional issues, significant challenge was where do we find clients? How can we reach out to investors who we felt, small investors who we felt quite confident were out there, but how could we find them and how can we make them aware of our services? We received quite a bit of favorable publicity when we started the clinic, both from national and local newspapers, and that certainly helped in raising public awareness of the clinic. In addition, the clinic reached out to Alan Charney, who was the executive director of the Joint Committee on Legal Referral Cities, which is sponsored by the New York City Bar Association and the State Bar Association. And we approached Mr. Charney about the possibility that the service might refer investors with small claims to the clinic. And he was very encouraging. He thought this fit well within the mission of the referral service. And after a couple of meetings where we discussed the proposal and our proposal was thoroughly vetted, the service agreed to refer inquiries from investors with small claims to the clinic. This proved to be an effective resource for clinic service. And in the first 2 years, for example, of the clinic's operation, 34 investors were referred to the clinic from the City Bar's referral services.
Great, really interesting. So, and I'd like to make a shout out here to Barbara, who invited me to join in teaching the clinic or co-teaching the clinic in the fall of 1999, and the rest is history. I really would not be where I am today if it were not for Barbara and being willing to take a shot on me and let me join in what I thought was super important work. So let me turn to Bruce. And you founded your clinic, I believe, the Howard Clinic, in 2009. So why don't you tell us a little bit what prompted you to start that clinic and perhaps discuss any challenges you might have faced in doing so?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Jill, and thank you to the Historical Society for inviting me to join this panel. When I came back from, I was on a trip to East Africa, helping the country of Ethiopia develop a stock market. I was contacted by the late Professor Tamar Meekins. She was the head of our clinical law program at Howard University. Tamar knew that Howard was always had a history of providing service, but primarily through its criminal law clinic, as well as its fair housing clinic, and also its civil rights clinic, including the work of the late Justice Thurgood Marshall. So Tamar's vision was that the Howard Law School could expand its service to the community by offering an investor justice clinic. And her challenge, she told me, was to find somebody to run it, develop it, draft a curriculum, run it, and be available to teach it. So for me, it was a fortunate timing because I just come back from East Africa and I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do next? And so it all worked out. What I'd like to do is thank the FINRA Investor Education Foundation. They provided the seed money for not just our clinic, but a few other clinics around the country. And it was a very generous grant. So that helped Howard make the decision that, this is a clinic they want to do because it wasn't going to come out of their pocket. But I think they're happy with it. They kept the program going even after our first 3 years of funding by FINRA ran out. So we've been on the law school's dime ever since then. It gave me a good opportunity to work with these fabulous students. They all have a dedication to serving the public. We just gave them a new avenue to do it, the investor justice area. And they've risen to the challenge. So it's been fascinating and heartwarming to see how they've done over the years. So what I also wanted to point out is that we were lucky. We already had other clinics who were able to help us get our curriculum started, give us advice. And I just want to thank you and all the other clinic directors on this program for what they did to help us get started, get our curriculum started, help us determine what kind of materials we could use that would be helpful to the students. And I also want to give a good shout out to Paul, who ran those fabulous annual clinic roundtables with delicious lunches that we all now miss and hope to do again one day soon. But those were great opportunities for us as a new clinic to get to know the other clinic directors and what you were doing and how you do it. So that is how we got started. But I have to give a tremendous credit to Tamar Meekins. She unfortunately passed away, but she did a great job of filing the application with FINRA, getting the funding, as well as Professor Cheryl Nichols, who teaches the securities law course. So that's how we got started. That's how I connected with them. And here we are, 2022, we're still open.
Wonderful, wonderful. So Barbara had mentioned some challenges in terms of getting referrals that she solved in some ways by connecting with the bar attorney referral service. Did you have a similar experience in first getting referrals?
Yeah, that's a good point that Barbara made. Because you walk into the clinic, you're not going to have a bunch of clients just waiting for you. You got to find them. So my first push was to just get out into the community. I did radio programs, did a couple of TV programs, just got the word out among the bar organizations, my friends and colleagues from my former days as an SEC lawyer and at FINRA, and just kind of get the word spread around the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area that we're here to help. And it wasn't long before the clients began to call us, and then we were off and running. So yeah, that was a challenge, but we got through it, and today we're still doing well with getting clients that come to us both directly and through referrals.
Wow, so great. That's terrific. So I can't ask Christine or Paul the question about founding the clinic because both of them joined their clinics as directors quite a few years or some years after they were founded. But let me ask about some of the work that the clinic does and has done under your supervision. So Paul, first, can you describe briefly the kinds of cases that your clinic brings and then focus on perhaps one memorable clinic case for our audience?
Sure. So thanks for including me in this program too. Thanks to Jane Cobb and the Historical Society and Bruce for your shout out. I'll give a quick shout out to the people who were responsible for founding it. Pam Chapiga and Romaine Gardner started teaching it, and Gus Katsouris on our faculty was instrumental. So, like all the clinics, we represent clients in the FINRA arbitrations, and usually it's unsuitability, but sometimes we represent outright fraud. Some clients who've been victims of Ponzi schemes or completely fake investments. And those cases, as we all know, get resolved often by settlements, sometimes by mediations, and if all else fails, by arbitration. So I think we're all very fortunate to work in this realm. And, Bruce touched on us getting together periodically. We all learn from each other, and it's a wonderful community to be part of. So each case, we bring, only a few cases given the nature of a clinic at a time, but we really work up those cases. And one case, there are a lot of cases that are memorable, but one I'll talk about is memorable not just for the facts, but also because of the way it got to us. And cases can come to us in somewhat unique and strange ways, and this was one of them. So I had a former student who graduated, was working pro bono in a different area of law. A client came to him in that area, and he learned that she had lost a lot of her investment money. And so because he had been a student in my clinic, he referred her to us. And it's a very sad story. Our client's husband was a dishwasher at Windows on the World in the World Trade Center, was killed on 9/11. As a result, just like all the relatives of the victims of the terrorist attack received some compensation from the government. And she had never invested before. So like most first-time investors, she sought out a broker to help her so that she could help her family and her children. And she sought out a broker who came from the same country she had come from originally and spoke her language, which is not uncommon, and which increased the level of trust she had in him. And sadly, that trust was completely misplaced. So, over the course of the time that the broker invested her money, and I guess I use that term loosely, basically he churned the count by just trading just to pocket the commissions for himself and his company, and also invested in highly, highly risky investments. So we were heading to arbitration. Students worked hard on the case. I had a team of 4 students. We had already prepped an expert. And on the eve of the arbitration, our adversary asked if we would be willing to mediate the case. And so we were, and the students did a great job, giving opening comments, counseling the client, arguing to the mediator. And after 9 hours, we were able to reach a settlement. And it was fortunately a very favorable settlement. So it was nice to get not only the money for our client, but the closure for her after she really had been taken advantage of by this broker.
Wow, that is quite a sad story. I'd heard part of that story originally, but I don't think I heard it with that level of detail. So it's very moving. And Paul, just to follow up a little bit, and then I'm going to ask Bruce and possibly Christine the same question. So, that work by your students seems like a pretty tremendous impact on your client. So could you just briefly talk about the impact generally that the work your students do has on the clients of the clinic? I mean, we all know it because we've all been, in that shoes, but perhaps our audience doesn't know.
On the clients, you said, right?
The impact on the clients, yeah.
Yeah, I think, it's interesting because, understandably clients realize they're students, and but we explain to them what a clinic's all about, and really quickly, because of the hard work and the real abilities, and hopefully, I'd like to think close supervision we give them, students quickly win our clients over. And learn about the case very quickly, work really hard about it, are very committed to it, very responsive to clients. And so, after my first arbitration, where students really did all the main roles, our client said to me, "I hope you give them all A pluses." And there's nothing better to hear from that. So I think all of us probably have the same experience where our clients, we get to choose our cases, obviously, so we only choose merit, cases with a lot of merit. But I think that the impact for the clients is wonderful, and they really like working with students. They're early in their careers, and they're helping them as well.
Great. Bruce, what about you in terms of a memorable case and the impact that it might have had on your clients? We'll turn to students in a little bit, but
okay. Well, sure, yeah, and like Paul, we've had a lot of interesting cases, but there's one in particular that I wanted to point out that I think really highlights the impact that our clinics have on both the professional development of students and also the impact it has on the lives of our clients that we represent. Many of them elderly, a lot of them low educated. So in one case, we represented an elderly widow and who was a retiree who was sold an unsuitable variable annuity that had considerable surrender charges and very complex provisions. She must have been given a package of about 500 pages of documents to review before she bought the annuity, and she didn't have much education. So as a result, she lost a lot of money when one day she needed her money. She wanted to retire and move back to her home country of Grenada. So she sold the annuity. But then she got hit with all the charges and all the fees and all the losses that occurred in her variable annuity accounts. So to understand this case, the students had to really study all those documents, the writers, the financial statements. They did considerable research. They drafted settlement memos, and they had a very, very difficult opposing counsel who was an outside lawyer for the annuity company. And apparently, we came to the conclusion he was probably trying to increase his fees because he dragged this case out a long time, and he filed a lot of motions. The students were up to the task. They responded to the motions, and I think we won every single motion that he filed. The students, they also had to engage in a very heated, challenging discovery, and they had to prepare a motion to compel, which they won, and we got a lot of significant information, including the broker's notes. And the thing about the notes is they were helpful because of what they did not show. And what they did not show was him having any conversations about the surrender charges, the complexity of the annuities, whether or not it was suitable for this particular investor. So that was very helpful. So now we're going to hearing. Opposing counsel had pushed this case out for months, and now the hearing is scheduled for the very next day. And the students and I are in my office preparing for a hearing. And now we get a call from counsel, like in Paul's case, and they want to know, are we interested in trying to resolve it before we go to the hearing the very next day? So after about 2 hours of back and forth negotiations with the counsel, and also, we're on the phone with the investor because every time he gives us a settlement number, we got to call her up and see if she wants to take it. And then finally, we get him to give us a number that she's willing to take, and it's almost everything that she had lost. So now we agree to settle. We then call FINRA and we tell them, cancel the hearing. And later on, we get the check. So it was amazing to see how the students, and the students were so relieved. They wanted, they wanted to go to hearing, but they wanted to get the lady her money. And you don't know what's going to happen at the hearing. So they were very relieved, and you could just tell by the expressions on their faces, they were happy this thing was about to end. So now we finally get the check, and the lady had already moved to Grenada, but she came back to tidy up some last minute details in her life. So she came by our office to get the check, and she actually came to the class. So the class got to meet her, and the two students that worked the case got a chance to hand her the check, and she was in tears. She was so overjoyed. And then what really, really set it off was when she pulled out her checkbook and wrote a donation check to Howard Law School and handed it to the students. So that had to be one of the most joyous classes we've had. And the students all clapped, and she gave us two students that worked their case big hugs. And it was just a fantastic way to see the impact that they had on this lady's life.
Wow. I actually just got chills hearing that story. Thank you for sharing that, Bruce. That was terrific. Christine, we haven't heard from you yet, so I'm just going to pivot to you just briefly on a similar kind of question about the impact on the clients. And we will hear from you later about being a student in Fordham's clinic before you became a director yourself. So just love to hear your perspective.
Well, I'd like to just start also with my thanks to the SEC Historical Society for recognizing all the important work that the clinics do and have done over the past 25 years. In terms of the impact on clients, I actually want to focus on a case where the outcome wasn't as happy. We were representing a client. He was an immigrant. He spoke English as a second language. He went into his local bank branch, and the broker convinced him to take money from his savings account and invest in a variable annuity. And, we investigated, and we thought he had a really strong case, and we brought an arbitration claim on his behalf. And unfortunately, the arbitration panel didn't agree with us, and found for the brokerage firm. And we called the client to share the outcome, and he asked if he could come into the clinic. So we invited him in. He wanted to bring the students pastries and thank them in person, because even though we weren't successful, we had provided such an invaluable service to him. He had been turned down by so many attorneys, and the students over the course of several semesters spent hundreds of hours going through his documents, listening to his story, drafting the documents, and then going through the arbitration. And he knew at that point, even though the arbitrator didn't agree with us, we had done everything we could for him and on his behalf. And that gave him closure and gave him peace of mind that he had actually done what he could have done. And even though it wasn't the outcome he wanted, he was just so grateful for what we were able to do for him.
Wow, that's a terrific story as well. And I agree that, when I was teaching the clinic at Pace, even losing cases gave these investors, at least gave them a voice, gave them an opportunity to be heard, and whether or not they won or lost. So I share your experience in terms of the impact on the clients. So let's just talk a little bit about our own careers, because I can say without any hesitation that Barbara, as I said earlier, bringing me in to join her to co-teach the clinic many years ago was absolutely critical to the launch of my career as a legal educator. So Christine, you started in the clinic as a student at Fordham, as I just said, and now run it and have many other titles. Could you just talk a little bit about how the clinic impacted your career as an educator?
Sure. So I started teaching in the clinic at St. John's in 2007. And this was right before the market crash. And as you mentioned, this was the second wave of clinics. St. John had received money from the New York Attorney General and had the ability to hire a supervising attorney. So I came in as a supervising attorney funded by the grant and was supposed to be here for 2 years. Well, a lot happened in those next 2 years. And when the 2 years were up, the market had crashed. The need for the clinics like ours at St. John's was just so obvious and so significant at that point. And even though our grant money was running out, the law school recognized that the service we provide to the students and the service we provide to the community was so incredibly important. And the school decided it was going to just put hard money behind the clinic. And so they gave me the opportunity at that point to stay on with the clinic. And at that point, that really gave me the opportunity to move beyond being a practitioner, because in my mind, I was still a practitioner. It was a 2-year stint. It was going to be temporary. I was going to go back to doing defense work. But at that point, I knew I had the opportunity to really become a professor. And now, 15 years later, I can't imagine ever doing anything else. And I'm just so incredibly grateful that this is what I get to do every day, and help the next generation of lawyers find their voice, find their practice style, and also help investors who have no place else to turn and just so need the help we're giving them. And I now have the opportunity to teach other classes. And when I do, I can connect those classes with the real world experience of the clients we're representing in the clinic. And so the work becomes so much more real for the students, especially those who've had the opportunity to be in the clinic themselves. And I also get to write and engage in policy work. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about the policy efforts, but I have a platform now to raise awareness of the issues small investors deal with. And we are the voice of the small investor that sometimes gets overlooked by other advocates in the forum. And we can take steps to help protect investors before they're even harmed in the first place.
Wow, terrific. Paul or Barbara, I haven't discussed this with you, but I suspect you also, teaching this clinic has really impacted your broader career as an educator. And I just love to quickly hear about that, if you don't mind. Paul?
Okay.
Barbara, either one.
Okay. Just very quickly. So when I started the clinic in 97, I was already a tenured professor. I was the traditional podium teacher. I taught corporations and contracts and securities regulation. And I have to say, selfishly, that starting the clinic was just tremendous for my career, because it really turned my focus and my academic interest, my scholarship interests, in a totally different area. I really started to focus on investor rights and specifically FINRA arbitration. And that led to Jill and I, a few years later, we did a survey of participants in the FINRA arbitration system that had quite a bit of influence in terms of FINRA's rulemaking process. And I'm really of things I've done in my career, I think that's probably one of the things I know it's one of the things I'm most proud of, that we did that scholarship and it contributed to policy changes, rule changes at FINRA. And I never would have gone down that route had it not been for starting the clinic.
Great. Paul, just real quick.
Yeah, so clinic was the best experience I had in law school. So when I was a prosecutor and thinking about what I want to do when I grow up, I loved litigating. I loved teaching. I taught as an adjunct at Columbia, where I went, and I really wanted to be a clinical professor. And I lucked into this clinic. I would have taught a lot of different clinics. I had worked on securities or supervising securities cases before, but not these types of cases. And I got to co-teach with Romain Gardner, learned from him, and it's a tremendous experience because, like Barbara and Christine and you and Bruce have talked about. There's nothing better than working on cases for clients and working with smart, motivated students.
Great, thank you. So I want to switch gears just a little bit because Christine mentioned a little bit about the Investor Justice Act, which we're going to talk about soon. But just more generally, we've talked about the kinds of cases that our students work on. But many of the clinics have expanded the type of work they've done to advocacy work. And one of the things I know we've been focused on is advocacy for continuing to fund clinics. And today, unfortunately, the number of securities clinics open has dropped from, I believe, a peak of 23 at one point in time, somewhere around there. And now it's down to, I believe, 10, maybe 11. And the Investor Justice Act is now pending in Congress, which, among other things, proposes a sustainable source of funding for securities clinics. So, Christine, I know you've been an advocate and having your students be an advocate for that act and what it proposes. So could you just share with us your view of that and how that fits into the securities clinics?
Sure. So there is a tremendous need for the clinics like the one I run at St. John's and at Pace and Howard and Fordham. And as you mentioned, there are 10 clinics right now across the country that are actively taking cases and working with investors. But they're located in 5 states and Washington, D.C. So that means in 90% of the states across the country, there are no clinics. And the investors don't have any resources available to them to determine whether or not they even have a claim. And what we do is just so important, whether we're representing a client who lost retirement savings or we're explaining to a client why they don't have a legal claim. We're taking the time to listen to them, hear their issues, and explain to them what happened. So even for those clients where we don't bring a claim, they have closure and can move on without wondering what more they should have done. So, you know, we're doing a number of different things. We are representing those clients who do have claims, and we're spending time and giving dignity to the clients who know something went wrong or don't understand what happened and explaining to them what happened. We also engage in a tremendous amount of investor education. My clinic has conducted investor education seminars and have reached hundreds of investors from libraries, senior centers, American Legion posts. And the goal there is to just raise awareness of ways investing can go wrong, what investing is sometimes, and also alert investors to different types of scams so that they understand they may not have done anything wrong. They may have actually been a victim, but understanding what their rights are, but also, you know, taking the steps to actually prevent them from becoming victims of scams in the first place. But at the end of the day, these clinics are expensive for law schools to run. And unfortunately, grant sources are incredibly limited for these types of clinics because we're not helping a traditional legal services client. And while state regulators and the FINRA Foundation have been incredibly generous and have provided funding, there really are no sources of regular ongoing funding for the clinics at this point. So the Investor Justice Act was envisioned and introduced after the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee looked at this issue, heard from clinic directors and a student who we'll hear from on the next panel, and then made a recommendation that the SEC provide startup and ongoing funding for the clinics. And I was lucky that my school was able to commit funding, but so many other schools have not been that lucky, and the clinics have shut down. And again, that means investors are left with so many fewer resources. And given the SEC's mission of investor protection, a grant program coming out of the SEC fits well within that goal, and quite frankly, will be money really well spent.
Great, thank you. So we only have a few minutes left before we shift to the next panel, but we talked about impact on us, impact on clients. Paul, would you just mind taking a few minutes to talk about what you think the impact has been on your students. I think you're muted, Paul.
Sorry about that. I should know that by now.
No
So
worries.
one of the great parts of teaching these clinics is the growth you see during the semester. You know, at the beginning, we ask students questions. What should we do? And of course, their answer is, I don't know. I just got here. You're supposed to know what you're doing. But it starts the process of having them take ownership of the case, of thinking of themselves as being the lawyer, so that after a few weeks, they generate tremendous ideas, great strategies, and they're really a full participant in the clinic. They also, as we've noted, right, get a firsthand opportunity to see what a difference it makes for clients to have lawyers. And then, as Chairman Levitt talked about at the beginning, and Christine did too, it's so important to have representation. And of course, they get skills, right? Interviewing, counseling, negotiations, but they also get arbitration skills, right? Last year, we had a 5-day arbitration, and students did the openings, the closing arguments, the directs of our clients and expert, the cross-examinations. But a lot of people think clinics are about skills. Of course they are. But they're about much more than that, right? It's the ability to teach students to think critically in context of representing clients, where they can improve not only their judgment, but also their decision making. And I think those are some of the traits that separate good from great lawyers. Lastly, it's one of the few opportunities students have to work extremely closely with colleagues, right, in teams. We have teams of 2, it's sometimes 4, and to work under really close supervision of a faculty member who all of us really practiced a lot before we got here. And so alumni tell us that the clinic experience really enabled them to hit the ground running, to enter practice, really prepared to do excellent work on behalf of clients. And I know from speaking to my clinical colleagues around the country, their graduates feel the same way.
Great. Bruce, you want to add anything to that in terms, you've already mentioned a little bit about the impact on your students with your story, but.
Yeah, I just want to add to what Paul just said. I echo everything Paul just said about the impact it's had, but I just want to add a couple of things. I think it also has helped the students develop the confidence to know that if you're prepared, you can go up against any counsel, no matter how experienced, and come out successful. I think that's one good thing the clinic teaches them. And I'm delighted to say that a lot of the clinic students have sent me emails, or they sent letters to the dean, or we have to be evaluated every year, just like every other professor. And in the evaluations, they will consistently say that the investor justice clinical experience was the best experience they had in law school. That's always good to hear. Although I basically wonder what else is going on in the law school, but so I think that's and also, of course, the last thing, it's helping them to get employment in the securities field. We've had several students who've gone on to, some work for FINRA, some work for the SEC, some are at JP Morgan Chase and other places and big law firms. So it's really helping them get opportunities beyond law school as well. And they're doing, a lot of the work they're doing is related to what they learned in the clinic. So they're very happy about that as well. So I think it's a great experience.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I just want to thank all of our panelists today for such an enlightening discussion. We're going to pivot in a moment to hear from students themselves about what the clinic meant to them. And as I said before, Christine was a student in Fordham's clinic and now will be on that panel to discuss her perspective as a former student. So I'm going to hand over the program to Ron Long. He is now head of aging client services for Wells Fargo. And when he was a lawyer at the Securities and Exchange Commission, he helped then Chairman Levitt introduce the investor rights clinic concept to law schools. We thought it'd be interesting, as I said, to hear from some former clinic students and learn how the experience impacted their professional careers. So Ron, take it away.
Thanks, Jill, for that handoff. And I want to thank the SEC Historical Society as well for putting this program together. And I enjoyed hearing from Barbara Black. What she left out of that first meeting was, I think she and Vanessa Mertens definitely worked me over. And I'm pretty sure I left thinking there was no chance we'd ever have a school clinic at Pace Law School. So just goes to show you can't always judge a meeting by the cover. So let's talk to our students, and we think this is a very interesting panel. These are folks who actually went through law clinics, and then went on. So our first panelist will be Qudsiya Shafiq, who did her time at Georgia State Clinic, but is now Associate General Counsel at Edward Jones. And if we next would go to Toyin Momo, who went to Howard and did his time at the Investor Justice and Education Clinic there. And he's now a senior counsel at the SEC. And I was going to give the full intro for Christine, but you've already heard from Christine in the full intro. But I do think it's important that she now puts on the clinical student hat and as an alumni and talks us through some of those issues. So I got a bunch of crazy questions here, but let's start with the first one I have. And I'll start with you, Qudsiya, if you don't mind. And it is essentially telling us why, for all the reasons you went to law school, there were good ones, but then you get in law school and you decide, I want to participate in the investor rights clinic. Walk us through that decision and why you made it.
Sure. So for me, it was really a combination of my personal and professional interests. I've always had a passion for public service, and I realized shortly after graduating from undergrad that I was interested not just in the law, but business and finance and econ. And so when I learned about the Investor Advocacy Clinic at my school and the syllabus for the prerequisite course that we had to take in order to join the clinic, it just spoke to me. And I knew right then and there that I was going to sign up for that. So it was great timing and a great marriage of all my interests.
That's great. Toyin, why don't you walk us through your decision making?
Sure. So for me, I started out in the securities industry before I actually entered law school. So I already had, I think, at least some path that I was trying to charter in terms of which direction I wanted to go when I attended law school. And when the clinic came to my attention, at that point, I felt that was like a perfect opportunity for me to couple my experience in the past and also gain some student attorney experience, because while I was at Howard, a lot of my colleagues were in other clinics, whether it be civil rights, whether it be the fair housing clinic, and they would always rave about the experience they had as student attorneys. And as a student myself, I always would hear that you get the real experience when you practice. So I felt that was honestly the prime opportunity for me to say that I'm an attorney. While I might not necessarily have my law degree yet, it'd be a perfect opportunity for me to get that exposure to meeting with clients and all the different experiences that come with practicing. So that was essentially it for me. When I joined at that point, I didn't know much about it. Just being at the Investor Justice Clinic was new to Howard at the time. But just from, I guess, having the confidence in my experience and knowing what I wanted to do, I think that kind of gave me at least the push to move forward with it. And it ended up being a great investment.
Christine, walk us through your decision when you got to Fordham.
Sure. So I was an evening student. I was working a full-time job during the day that wasn't legal related, but was within the industry. And by the time I got to my last semester of law school, I didn't have any legal experience at all, and I didn't have a job. And so I actually had the opportunity, I had just stopped working, and I had the opportunity to participate in Fordham Securities Arbitration Clinic. And that was the only one I considered even participating in, given the fact that I knew I had interest in securities at that point. It actually made my day job make sense because I was working as a secretary for a branch office of MetLife. And when I got to securities regulation, that was when I understood why I did most of what I did during the day. So I knew this was going to be an opportunity to actually get a little bit of legal experience before I graduated and then hopefully find a job. So I did it the last semester. And as I said, I had stopped working, which meant I had nothing to do all day. So I spent every minute in the clinic that I wasn't in class. And then I even stayed on while I was studying for the bar over the summer. I actually stayed on the clinic as a summer intern post-graduation. Because for me, I needed something to do while I was studying, and knowing that I could be doing legal work, but also helping investors it wasn't even a thought. I was like, of course I wanted to do that. So it gave me the motivation to keep studying and pass the bar exam, but also gave me more opportunities to increase my legal skills at that point. And I just want to say I'm so grateful to the two amazing professors I had at Fordham, Pam Chapika, who started the clinic there, and Marcella Silverman, who gave me the confidence that I could be a lawyer. So really did change my life.
That's fabulous. Let's stick with that point there. Toyin, did you feel the clinic delivered on the concepts you had when you chose to go into it?
Oh no, absolutely. I also thought that it was even more rewarding than I envisioned, because I understood that I would have an opportunity to serve a number of clients. However, thanks to Professor Sanders, he was able to see clients that actually needed our help. So it wasn't just an opportunity for us just to learn from him. We were actually like tasked with the responsibility of preparing for cases and like seeing a client that actually was able to recover damages, I think was one of the more rewarding experiences, especially at that point in my career, just being that I had never done anything to that degree. So I would say it definitely exceeded my expectations of the clinic experience for sure. So,
And
that's
Kasia,
something to
did the
talk about.
clinic, sorry, Tony.
Oh, no worries.
No, Kasia, I was going to ask you the same question. Did you feel the clinic delivered on what you were looking for?
Yes. And so when I joined the clinic, I really didn't know what to expect. I was just so interested. I was willing to absorb anything and everything I got out of it. But now that I look back at it and after comparing it to other internships and just other experiences, like I would say the clinic was certainly the most impactful experience of my life and led me to the career path and the career that I have today. So.
And Christine talked about in the other panel that the clinics do so much more than simply represent clients in arbitration. They're kind of the voice of that small investor or the investor. You see it, and unfortunately I've been on the other side of that comment letter from the law school that says, Ron Long, you're dead wrong on this comment that you just submitted, and we think you should do the opposite. Of the different experiences you had in the clinic, I know, Kutsia, you actually had an opportunity to testify in front of the SEC Investor Advisory Council. So, and I'll start with you, Toyin, but what part of the clinic experience did you find most interesting?
I would say the outreach within the community was quite interesting. So being that I went to Howard within the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, there are a lot of churches that had a huge population of underserved investors. So the church that I actually grew up in was about 10 minutes away from Howard. And we held a workshop there where we discussed the pros and cons, of investing, things to look out for, considering the fact that there's affinity fraud out there for folks within that age bracket. That was something that we tried to spend a lot of time discussing. And you could see how appreciative they were of the information they provided, and also like how enlightening it was, being that they might have had different annuity plans, they might have had different savings that they may have created for their generations to come, whether it be their grandkids and so on and so forth. But I think just having an opportunity to discuss with them some of the different things to be careful about, things to look out for, and then also creating a relationship with the church in that capacity, I think was something that not only myself, but my classmates that were part of this outreach program were also very appreciative, and also I think grateful to be a part of. So I would say that was one for sure.
Christine, other than getting you through the bar, what aspect of the clinical experience did you find most interesting?
So one of the cases we were working on required us to do on-site discovery. The firm said they didn't have the resources to get us documents, and we said, that's okay, we'll come get them ourselves. So we actually spent several weeks at the brokerage firm going through trade tickets to pull the documents we needed. And again, just knowing that what we were doing for the client, like, again, we would have spent hundreds of hours if we needed to. it really gave me the ability to really understand the intricacies of what it takes to bring a case forward, but also made me really appreciate how hard this is to do without representation.
Good see you. Can you tell us what aspect did you find interesting or most
Sure.
interesting?
Sure. So I think it's going to be very difficult for me to just narrow it down to one aspect, because really I loved every aspect. I think the most interesting part was the variety of experiences I got from just a single clinic that, like I mentioned earlier, I didn't really get from my other internships or classes. And so, you're learning about investors and how their life has been impacted by investment recommendations. You're communicating with opposing counsel and negotiating real settlements that directly benefit your clients. And in my particular case, like, we were able to work with our state securities division in Georgia. I was able to testify, as you mentioned earlier, in front of the SEC Investor Advisory Committee about how important this work is. And I was able to meet former investor advocate Rick Fleming and SEC commissioners and FINRA regulators. And as I was graduating, we also had the opportunity, our law school had the opportunity to host an SEC town hall event. So when I look at all these experiences, it's really difficult for me to narrow down just one, but collectively, they're unique experiences that I would not have had without the clinic. So very impactful.
Sure. I'm going to start with this one with you, Christine, but I think we may already know the answer. But talk to us about the impact of the clinical work on your current career or your career path.
Sure. So it is not an overstatement to say the clinic is responsible for me being where I am today and doing what I'm doing today. And really my entire career as a securities lawyer started with my clinic experience. Like I said, coming into the clinic, I didn't have any legal experience and I was going into my last semester without a job. So not only did the clinic give me experience, it actually led to my first job after law school. And that first job was representing brokerage firms who had been sued by investors like the ones we were representing in the clinic. And that job came from my clinic experience. The attorney who hired me had come to one of our clinic seminars as a guest speaker. He was a defense attorney. He was actually law school classmates with one of my professors. And it turned out he was looking for an associate. And he knew that students coming out of the clinic were going to be able to hit the ground running. And that he could hire any of us and we would be good to go on day one, which was so important because it was a small firm. Doing the defense work representing the large firms in the industry. And he had confidence that not only did I have the lawyering skills, but I knew the subject matter. And he really did value the experience, the work experience I had, which was really important. So at that point, I left the clinic and started doing defense work. And even though I switched sides from representing investors, I never lost the appreciation and the perspective I had from representing the clinic's clients. And that really did make me a better defense attorney. We counsel clients to write checks when we thought that was the right thing to do. And interestingly, that defense experience actually made me a much better claimants attorney investor attorney when I did come back to this side, and had the opportunity to participate in the clinic at St. John's now as a director and a supervising attorney.
Speaking of sides, arguably you're on the other side. Talk to us about how you think the clinical experience impacted your career to this point.
Sure. So I think it's safe to say, similar to you, Christine, that I would not be in the practice area that I'm in if I didn't have the opportunity to participate in the clinic. And I don't think a clinic can have any greater impact on a student than directly leading them to the career that they're in and it being their personal passion. So I just look back and I realized, like, I learned so much that I still apply today. I learned about products and industry players. And I learned about federal securities laws, and blue sky laws. And what I did and didn't want to do in this field. I knew I didn't want to litigate. I wanted to do more of the regulatory compliance, transactional work. I learned amazing practice pointers from our clinic director, Nicole Leanna. She, I would say, contributed to my development in ways she probably doesn't even know. And most importantly, you learn about the clients that you're impacting and that your work impacts. And so when you develop this like personal connection with these clients and you hear their stories and you hear how they trusted someone maybe that they shouldn't have, you're very cognizant of what you do day to day, whether that's drafting disclosures and making sure that individuals can read them and understand them, and you do whatever you can to make sure that nothing bad happens to clients like those, and that we limit the number of clients in those situations. So I would say ultimately it had a great impact on my career.
And Toyin, speaking of sides, you're like the coin that flips and ends up on the edge. But why don't you tell us what you think the clinical experience?
Sorry, it went in and out on my end.
I think it went. Did you get the question? Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. I got the question overall.
Okay.
But I would say the clinic experience was definitely very impactful on my career right out of law school and even up to now. So right after law school, I actually was on the private side where I was representing investors against brokerage firms. So having that experience in which I would be able to review client records, customer agreements while in law school, I think gave me that preparation that I would need going forward, knowing what I would need to look out for when you're engaged in a matter in which there's a dispute between an investor and your given brokerage firm. So I think that at least gave me that background. And then up to now, while I'm at the SEC, while I'm on the other side of the coin now, it's also very important, I think, for me to always reference that experience, because at the end of the day, the goal was to protect investors then, and that's still ultimately the goal now in my current day to day. And I find that to be something that's always been a dedication of mine, a sense of purpose whenever I'm focus on any matter that I receive. I won't go into the details of all the different matters I'm working on now, but I would say that's definitely motivated me each day, that experience to make sure that the investors that are being represented, while it may be one matter that represents millions of others that may be a victim of fraud. So I think getting that foundation at that point in time, I think has been able to propel me, and it continues to do so on a daily basis.
Thanks. So this isn't a Georgia reference, though, Katsia, but everything obviously can't be peaches and cream. What was the most challenging part of your clinical experience?
I would have to say the time frame that you're in the clinic for. So for my clinic, we were limited to a maximum of 2 semesters. But as you know, like gathering all the facts and getting all the information and just the timeline of arbitration and submissions and all the steps that you take in between, it takes far longer than just a few months. It doesn't align nicely to your academic schedule. And so you don't always get to see, or you didn't always get to see a case from start to finish. But again, when you realize that time limitation, I think you do work harder and faster, and you're involved in different aspects of the case. But I think the most challenging part was not being able to see a case through all the time.
When you were at Howard, Toyin, what was the most challenging part of the clinic for you?
I would say at that point, it was my lack of experience. So whenever I would have a client meeting, I think I'll admit I was a little apprehensive as to whether or not I'd be able to communicate correctly or just articulate whatever I neneeded to say as a student versus someone that might have been an experienced investor that maybe didn't have the resources to find legal counsel elsewhere. But in order to overcome that, I was able to use the resources that were within my reach, whether it be a classmate of mine that I would collaborate with, and whether it be my professor, Professor Sanders, who spoke on the first panel, who has extensive SEC experience. So I think just being able to raise my hand and ask a question that might have seemed kind of dumb to me at that point in time, was actually, an envelope for him to just express or explain so much more than I thought I would have known on my own, or that I would have found on my own. So I think it was just very important to just taking advantage of the network in order to overcome those challenges.
Well, that sounds great. So let me go to you, Christine. The most challenging aspect of being that clinical student?
The clinic itself, not challenging. It was leaving the clinic to go do my other classes and making sure I didn't actually fail my last semester of law school. It was hard to focus on other classes and other things, knowing that what I was doing in the clinic was directly helping somebody. And so it really was challenging to put that aside at times to do other work, including study for the bar, but it all worked out.
Let me go to this question for you, Toyin, and Christine. I want you to think of another case because it's similar to a question asked in the previous panel. But tell us about your most memorable case, client, or experience at the clinic, Toyin.
Okay. So I'll be honest, the cases are a little bit fuzzy at this point, but I'll say there was a common letter that I did work on that does come to mind. It was a FINRA comment letter about the disclosures for retail investors before commencing the business relationship. So like having an opportunity to provide comments with a classmate as well on that was quite the experience, because we took that role quite seriously, having at least an opportunity to have our voice shared like within the folks within the FINRA office, which was in Rockville while I was in DC. A lot of folks interned there at the time. So it was, I think, quite the experience to at least have that exposure. That was quite the memorable experience. And I think the comments that we had a lot of backing too, just being that we did extensive research to see what kind of comments were submitted to FINRA in previous regulatory notices. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't too off base. We weren't asking for things that were maybe a bit extreme or not within the same realm of the commentary that they've received before. That was, I think, something that I think made I think our comments a bit more helpful. Some of the comments that we did provide spoke more to the level of detail in the disclosures that were given to the different clients. I think also considering the fact that some clients may not have had the experience that some had, like speaking to the unsuitability was something that we also recommended. So the fact that those were both recognized amongst a few others that can't come to mind right now. Pardon me, this was like about 10 years ago, but that I think made for a great experience.
Yeah, yours might have been one of those letters that said Ron Long is crazy. But Christine, talk to us about your most memorable client experience or matter.
So it's the case I mentioned about actually having to go to the firm to pull documents from the firm itself. We actually took that case to hearing the semester I was in the clinic. And it was a handful of things. One, it wasn't a typical securities issue. The firm had actually been misaveraging trade prices. So when trades were executed in pieces, they presented an average price for the trade to the client, and the average price was just wrong. And we went through the trade tickets, and we actually did all of the math and averaged out the trade prices, and then presented that to an arbitration panel, and our client testified and the other side testified, and we got to do all that, and we got an award for the client. And to make that phone call to the client and to tell them they were going to be getting a check back was just so incredibly impactful that 20 years later, I still remember doing that. So I think that really does, that was one of the most impactful moments in the clinic. And from students I've talked to in my own clinic now, having those conversations with the client really are just really memorable.
Good to see you. Take us down memory lane for you. What was your most memorable case, experience, or client?
Sure. So I had this one very sweet elderly lady from Minnesota, and she and her husband, who I believe was like a blue collar worker, had invested very responsibly. And at the recommendation of their advisor, who was actually her husband's longtime friend, they were placed into some variable annuity products that were not suitable for them. But ultimately they ended up losing most of their retirement savings, and she mailed us like these boxes of documents, and they dated back years if not decades. And she went to the library and did her research, and she went and contacted regulators and did everything she could. And so when she came to us, like, we wanted to help, and unfortunately we couldn't. So this isn't a happy ending or a story with a happy ending. Luckily we had those too. But I share the story because it's something that I carry with me every day. And I have in my previous roles where, I'm looking for doing certain compliance tasks, like looking for advisory fee billing errors and how that might impact clients, or how to identify that kind of bad behavior and help firms identify that. And today, as I draft disclosures and review like client facing materials, I just want to make sure that these investors are informed, they know what they're entering into, and that I'm doing everything I can to help prevent other investors end up in that same situation. And another reason I mentioned the story is because I wonder, if she had a clinic in Minnesota, would she be in the same position? One of the issues we had in that scenario was that we didn't have, there were jurisdiction issues, there were complexity issues with the products, but it always leads me to wonder, like, where would she have been if there was an investor rates clinic in Minnesota? So just something to keep in mind.
Well, that's a good segue. That was going to be my last question to you guys, saving you the political challenges there. But let's go to you first, Christine. Let's talk about the Investor Rights Clinics bill on Capitol Hill. If we're talking to, and you got both sides of the aisle, but what is the message to Capitol Hill about the need? I think Kutsia mentioned a little bit of it, the need for the funding of the investor rights clinics across the country.
Right. So I talked a little bit about all the different things clinics do and why the funding is so important. But my hope is, as the bill makes its way through both the House and the Senate, that across the aisle it's recognized as important. And really what it has to do with is, we're not taking cases because they're a learning experience for our students. We're taking cases that are a learning experience for our students because the clients need the help we can give them. And navigating the arbitration process on your own is so incredibly difficult that we talk to investors who walk away from valid claims because they don't have somebody to help them through the process.
Kutsia puts you in a little difficult spot, but I like doing that. In terms of your work at a firm, but what would be, and maybe you'll speak for yourself and not the firm, but what would be your testimony or advice to Capitol Hill on funding arbitration clinics?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I will speak on behalf of myself. Luckily, I work at a great firm with a strong compliance culture. But me personally, I think based on my experience, at the root of investor protection and investor advocacy is making sure that we're protecting the average retail investor. So the little guy or the small investor, and making sure that they have access to either affordable or altogether free legal representation when they need it, and guidance. And so I believe that it's only like the natural next step to increase funding and increase the number of clinics that we have out there to help represent these types of investors.
And I'll help you out, Toyin, and say that these comments are yours and yours alone and don't represent the commission, any of its individual commissioners or the staff or divisions of the SEC. But what do you think? What would you be saying to Capitol Hill as the individual?
No, that's much appreciated. But yeah, I would definitely concur with what my two panelists have also mentioned. I firmly believe also as a product of the student of the investor rights clinic at Howard University, it makes a huge difference. You know, while the benefit is for me as well to learn and gain that experience, I also feel that in this current climate where there's been an increase of investors over the last couple of years, that also leads to more issues for a number of investors who may not necessarily have the experience leading up to the experience that they might have gotten themselves in. And in order to reconcile that, you would need a lot more hands on deck. Of course, the lawyers at the various law firms are able to assist. Of course, they can reach out to different advocacy groups. However, people don't have the resources necessarily to maybe afford a lawyer that's charging XYZ per hour. And I think that's important to take advantage, or also just put the students to work who have a genuine interest in this area, for them to not only, as I mentioned, gain the experience, but also to serve the retail investor. And I think that would definitely make a huge difference going forward. And I leave it at that. I wouldn't say too much more.
No, that's fair. That's fair. So if we were to talk about current students, that first year law student, that second year law student, and if you could do the commercial for them about why they should participate in, and ideally their school will get one of these investor rights clinics, but participate in investor rights clinics. Let's start with you, Toyin. What is that recommendation?
I would say for them for the student that is right, would be my recommendation for the student to join the program, or like just to navigate the program essentially. I would tell the student just to take the opportunity quite seriously, because it is essentially the opportunity to be an attorney before you graduate, I would say. I felt that that was, I think, what I learned outside of the public service, outside of the awarding experiences. I also learned a lot on the job, I would say, because as a student, as you're taking the courses, you're getting the fundamentals, obviously. But I think when you're interacting with clients, those are soft skills that one cannot necessarily pick up on in the classroom. I think the clinic experience was very helpful in that regard. And I would also take advantage of the resources that are provided. I think any clinic within the country is usually led by someone that has experience in the industry already. So I think it's important to take advantage of your professor, who may be the partner, you know, in a sense, that you can go to for any questions that you may have. I think that was definitely helpful for me to help me navigate through some of the questions that I had, as I mentioned earlier, that seemed remedial in nature, being that I hadn't had a one-on-one with a client before, that made me more comfortable. And I feel that that was also the foundation that I needed going forward when I entered the law firm that I worked at for a couple of years, and also while I'm at the commission now. So yeah, I would say, yeah, it's definitely worth it. It's also an opportunity to get 6 credits if you're at Howard. So that was also a nice way to to close out the year. But I think it's a win-win all around.
Yeah, Christine, what's your sales pitch to that first or second year, possibly third year student?
Well, this is easy. I do it every semester. I give the sales pitch. So like Toyin said, it is the one place in law school you get to actually be a lawyer. So the students in the clinic aren't there to assist me on a case. They're there to represent the client, and I'm here to assist them. And what I tell students every semester is, you're working your way through law school. You've gotten to this point. You have the ability to do this. So what the clinic does for confidence, and challenging imposter syndrome that so many students feel in law school is just so incredibly important. And knowing you're doing it as the only help for the client. There really is no place else for these clients to go. So it's so incredibly rewarding to be able to do that type of work, knowing you're helping somebody who can't get help anywhere else, and that you're getting to be a lawyer. And then the one other piece I'd say is, even if this isn't the type of law you want to do, you learn about the financial markets. And we haven't really talked about it, but financial literacy is so lacking across the country, and every opportunity to increase financial literacy, both as somebody who's about to enter the workforce, who will hopefully have investment funds very soon. In what we do in the clinic and doing the investor outreach and the investor education efforts, it means the students are becoming the teachers. So they're learning the material well enough to convey it to others. And I think that just, it leads to increased investor protection across the board. I think you're muted.
I'm muted because of the motorcycle, sorry. But I think you and Tonya both described the investor education part of what you do. And that investor outreach in and of itself, I think, is invaluable. So you're going to close us out, Katsia, with your statement or sales pitch to the current law student about joining a clinic.
No pressure there.
No, of course not.
But I would say, if you have even the slightest interest in the securities industry or financial regulation, just give it a try. Don't be intimidated if you don't know what a security is. You'll learn, and you'll be surprised at how much you learn. To Christine's point, there's so much investor education that you provide to your clients, and in the process that you learn about being financially literate, and that's something that you carry on with you for the rest of your lives, as do your clients. So really, it's an investment in both retail investors and yourself. And so I would close out by saying, give it a try. You have nothing to lose, and I promise it can do wonders for your career.
Well, great words to end on. Thank you, Katsia. Thank you, Tonya, and thank you, Christine. Jane, if you're around, I'll turn it back over to you. Thanks again for the opportunity to lead this panel.
Thank you so much, Ron. Great job, and many thanks in particular for your personal support and generosity in making this particular program possible. And thanks to all of our panelists for such a thoughtful and insightful discussion. I feel like I learned a lot about the incredible, wide-ranging impact that these clinics have had on so many things. I hope our audience enjoyed today's program as much as I did. But I would be remiss in my role if I didn't take a 2-second time out to make a plug for support. Our organization does depend on the financial gifts from people who find value in the virtual museum's unique materials and programming like this. So if you haven't made a donation this year, we would greatly appreciate your support. Every dollar for what is our very small organization goes a long way. Just click on, there's a Give Today button at the top of the page that you're watching this program from, and you'll see a range of support options. Thank you again to all of our panelists. What a terrific group of folks, clinicians and former students, for your terrific insights and for taking the time to prepare for this program, which will be put into our permanent collection. And again, as I mentioned before, part of a new exhibit that we'll be launching in a few weeks. So with that, I will bid adieu and say have a great rest of your day.